You're nothing but a complete failure, and you'll never amount to anything." My father's voice boomed across the dining room, his face twisted with disgust as he pointed his finger at me. I sat there at our family dinner table in Sacramento, my hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. All I had done was mention that I was doing well with my work, but apparently, that was enough to set him off. "My name is Chloe Reyes. I'm 27 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the disappointment of my family. My father, Roberto, owns a small auto repair shop and has always believed that success only comes from traditional paths. My mother, Patricia, usually stays quiet during these confrontations, her eyes downcast as she picks at her food. My older brother, Miguel, 30 years old and working as a bank manager, just smirked from across the table like he was watching his favorite television show. "What work?" my father continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Sitting in your apartment all day on that computer? That's not a real job. You don't even have a college degree. You're 27 years old and you have nothing to show for it." I wanted to defend myself, to tell him about the digital marketing firm I had been building from my one-bedroom apartment, about the clients who trusted me with their businesses, about the revenue I was generating. But every time I tried to speak, he cut me off. "Look at your brother," he said, gesturing toward Miguel. "He has a real career, a real future. He went to college, got his degree, and now he's somebody. You're just wasting your life." Miguel leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the show. "Come on, Dad. Be realistic. She'll be lucky if she can land a job at a fast food restaurant. At least then she'd have some structure in her life." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my cheeks burning with humiliation as I stared down at my untouched plate of chicken and rice. My mother finally looked up, but instead of defending me, she just shook her head sadly. "Chloe, maybe it's time you considered getting a real job," she said softly. "Something stable. Your father and I won't be around forever to help you." I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of their judgment, their complete dismissal of everything I had worked for, was crushing me. What they didn't know was that just 3 days ago, I had signed my third major client, a manufacturing company that was paying me $15,000 a month to handle their digital presence. But sitting there, surrounded by their contempt, I felt like maybe they were right. Maybe I was just fooling myself. Growing up in the Reyes household meant constantly being compared to Miguel. He was the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was the problem child who couldn't do anything right. When Miguel graduated high school with honors, my parents threw him a party with all our relatives. When I graduated with decent grades but decided not to go to college immediately, they barely acknowledged it. "College isn't for everyone," I had tried to explain back then. "I want to learn about business and marketing on my own terms." My father had laughed bitterly. "Business, marketing? You can't even keep your room clean. How are you going to run a business?" That conversation happened 9 years ago, but the sting of his words never faded. Instead of letting it destroy me, I used it as fuel. I spent hours every day teaching myself everything I could about digital marketing, social media management, and business development. I started small, helping local businesses in Sacramento create their online presence for $50 here and there. My first real breakthrough came 18 months ago when I landed a contract with a small restaurant chain. They were struggling to attract customers, and I developed a comprehensive social media strategy that increased their revenue by 40% in 6 months. Word spread, and soon I had more clients than I could handle. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family had no idea about my success. Every time I came to family dinners, they still treated me like the same failure who had disappointed them years ago. They never asked about my work, never showed any interest in what I was doing with my life. In their minds, I was still the girl who didn't go to college and therefore had no future. Miguel, meanwhile, loved to brag about his position at the bank, his new car, his plans to buy a house. My parents hung on his every word, praising him for his accomplishments and asking detailed questions about his career. The contrast was painfully obvious. "You should be more like your brother," my mother would say whenever she called me. "He has his life together." What she didn't know was that I had been quietly building something much bigger than Miguel's banking job. My client list now included 3 major companies, and my monthly revenue had reached $38,000. I had been saving aggressively, investing wisely, and building wealth that would make Miguel's salary look like pocket change. But I kept quiet about it all. Part of me wanted to prove them wrong dramatically, to show them exactly how wrong they had been about me. Another part of me was afraid that even if I told them about my success, they would find a way to diminish it or explain it away. Tonight's dinner had been the final straw. As I sat there listening to my father's cruel words and my brother's mocking laughter, I realized I was done trying to win their approval. I was done subjecting myself to their judgment and contempt. The breaking point came when my father stood up from the table, his face red with anger and frustration. "I'm sick of this conversation," he said, pointing at me again. "You're 27 years old, Chloe. 27. And what do you have to show for it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing." "Roberto, please sit down," my mother said weakly, but he ignored her. "No, Patricia. Someone needs to tell her the truth. Look at her, sitting there with that stubborn look on her face. She thinks she knows better than everyone else, but she's just deluding herself." Miguel chimed in with a cruel smile. "Dad's right, Chloe. You're living in a fantasy world. Whatever you think you're doing on that computer, it's not a real career. You need to face reality." My father nodded vigorously. "Exactly. And if you can't face reality, then maybe you shouldn't be here anymore. Maybe it's time you figure out how to survive on your own without running back to us every time things get tough." "I don't run back to you," I said quietly, finally finding my voice. "Don't you?" he shot back. "Who helped you with your rent last year when you were struggling?" I wanted to tell him that I had only asked for help once, and that was before my business really took off. I wanted to explain that I hadn't needed their financial help in over a year, that I was actually doing better than any of them realized. But I could see in his eyes that he wasn't interested in hearing anything I had to say. "You know what?" he continued, his voice getting louder. "I'm done enabling this behavior. If you want to keep living in your little dream world, you can do it somewhere else. Maybe when you're out there in the real world, struggling to pay your bills with your fake internet job, you'll finally understand what the rest of us have been trying to tell you." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother looked like she wanted to say something, but she remained silent. Miguel was practically grinning, clearly enjoying watching me get torn down. I slowly stood up from the table, my legs feeling shaky but my resolve growing stronger with each passing second. "You're right, Dad," I said calmly. "Maybe it is time for me to move on." He looked surprised by my calm response, probably expecting me to break down or argue with him. "Good," he said, though he sounded less confident now. "Maybe this will finally teach you some responsibility." I walked toward the door, grabbing my purse from the side table. As I reached for the handle, I turned back to look at my family one last time. My father was still standing, his arms crossed defensively. Miguel was watching with curious interest. My mother was staring at her hands. "Goodbye," I said simply, and walked out into the cool Sacramento evening, knowing that everything was about to change. I sat in my car outside my parents' house for several minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to process what had just happened. The words my father had spoken kept echoing in my mind. "You'll never amount to anything." For years I had absorbed that kind of verbal abuse, always hoping that someday they would see my worth, that someday they would be proud of me. But tonight was different. Tonight I realized that their approval was never coming, no matter what I accomplished. They had made up their minds about me years ago, and nothing I did would change their perception. The weight of that realization should have crushed me, but instead, it felt liberating. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, staring at the numbers that my family had no idea existed. My business checking account showed a balance of $247,000. My savings account held another $193,000. My investment portfolio, which I had been carefully building for the past 2 years, was worth over $400,000. In total, I was worth just over $840,000. Not quite the million I was working toward, but more money than my father would see in several years of running his auto shop. More money than Miguel would accumulate in a decade of his banking job. I started the engine and drove back to my apartment, my mind racing with possibilities. For months, I had been considering expanding my business, maybe even relocating somewhere more inspiring than Sacramento. I had been looking at properties in Lake Tahoe, dreaming of having an office with a view of the mountains and the water. When I got home, I immediately opened my laptop and began researching. Within an hour, I had found exactly what I was looking for: a beautiful lakefront cabin in South Lake Tahoe, available for immediate occupancy. The rent was $3,500 a month, which would have been impossible for the old Chloe, the one my family thought was a failure. But for the new Chloe, the successful entrepreneur they refused to acknowledge, it was completely affordable. I filled out the application that night, providing my business financial statements and bank records. The property manager called me the next morning, clearly impressed by my financial situation. "Miss Reyes, I have to say, your application is one of the strongest we've received," she said. "When would you like to move in?" "As soon as possible," I replied without hesitation. "We can have the lease ready for signing this afternoon if you'd like to drive up and see the property." I looked around my cramped apartment, thinking about the scene at my parents' house the night before. "I'll be there in 3 hours." The drive to Lake Tahoe gave me time to think about what I was doing. I was essentially cutting ties with my family, at least for now. I was moving 2 hours away from everything I had known, starting fresh in a place where no one knew my history or had any preconceived notions about my worth. When I arrived at the cabin, I fell in love immediately. It was everything I had imagined and more: floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, a spacious home office with mountain views, and enough privacy to focus entirely on growing my business. The property manager, a friendly woman named Janet, showed me around with obvious pride. "The previous tenant was a tech executive from San Francisco," she explained. "He used it as a retreat for creative thinking and strategic planning." I signed the lease that afternoon, writing a check for the first month's rent and security deposit without blinking. As I handed over $7,000 like it was nothing, I thought about how my family would react if they knew what I was doing. They probably thought I was going home to cry into my pillow, defeated and broken by their harsh words. Instead, I was upgrading my entire life. Moving day came exactly 1 week after the disastrous family dinner. I had hired professional movers to pack and transport everything from my Sacramento apartment to the Lake Tahoe cabin. As I watched them load my furniture and belongings into the truck, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. My phone rang several times during the move. The first call was from my mother. "Chloe, honey, where are you? I stopped by your apartment and there are moving trucks outside." I almost answered, but then I remembered my father's words. "Maybe it's time you figure out how to survive on your own." Well, that's exactly what I was doing. The second call was from Miguel. I let that one go to voicemail too. When I listened to it later, his message was typically condescending. "Hey sis, Mom said you're moving somewhere. Don't do anything crazy, okay? You know you can always come back home when this little rebellion phase is over." Little rebellion phase. The words made me laugh out loud. The drive from Sacramento to South Lake Tahoe took just over 2 hours, and with each mile, I felt lighter and more confident about my decision. When I finally pulled into the driveway of my new home, I sat in my car for a moment, taking in the breathtaking view of the lake surrounded by snow-capped mountains. The movers arrived shortly after me, and by evening, I was settled into my new space. I set up my home office immediately, positioning my desk so I could look out at the lake while I worked. The contrast between this peaceful, inspiring environment and my cramped Sacramento apartment was remarkable. That first night, I opened a bottle of wine and stood on the deck, breathing in the crisp mountain air. I pulled out my phone and finally decided to send one text message to my mother. "I'm safe and happy. I'll call you when I'm ready." I turned off my phone after that and spent the evening planning the next phase of my business expansion. I had been considering hiring additional contractors to help manage my growing client base, and now, with my new setup, I felt ready to take that step. Over the next 3 weeks, I threw myself into work with renewed energy and focus. The peaceful environment and stunning views seemed to unlock a new level of creativity and strategic thinking. I landed 2 new major clients, including a technology company based in Silicon Valley that was paying me $25,000 a month for comprehensive digital marketing services. My revenue had now reached $63,000 monthly, and I was projecting to cross the $1 million net worth mark within 6 months. The success felt even sweeter because I was achieving it entirely on my own terms, without my family's support or approval. I had been at the cabin for almost a month when I received an unexpected visitor. I was working in my office on a Tuesday morning when I heard a car pulling into my driveway. I looked out the window and was shocked to see Miguel's silver sedan. My heart started racing as I watched him get out of the car and look around with obvious confusion and amazement. He was clearly surprised by the quality and location of my new home. I could see him taking in the lakefront setting, the expensive-looking cabin, the peaceful surroundings that screamed success and affluence. He walked up to the front door and knocked. I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair, and went to answer it, knowing that this conversation was going to change everything between us. I opened the door to find Miguel standing there with an expression I had never seen before. A mixture of confusion, desperation, and barely concealed panic. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and his hair unkempt. The confident, smirking brother who had mocked me at dinner just a month ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Chloe," he said, his voice much quieter than usual. I need to talk to you." I gestured for him to come inside, curious about what could have brought him all the way to Lake Tahoe. As he stepped into the cabin, I watched his eyes widen as he took in the spacious, beautifully furnished interior, the high-end appliances, and the spectacular lake view through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "This place is," he started, then stopped, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. "How can you afford this?" "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, deliberately avoiding his question. I wanted to hear what he had to say before I revealed anything about my situation. We sat in the living room, and I could see Miguel trying to reconcile the luxury of my surroundings with his mental image of me as a failure. He kept looking around nervously, as if he expected someone else to appear and explain how his unsuccessful sister had ended up in a place like this. "Chloe, I'm in trouble," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Big trouble." I waited for him to continue, sipping my coffee and maintaining a neutral expression. "I got laid off," he said, the words coming out in a rush. 3 weeks ago. The bank is downsizing, and they eliminated my entire department. I thought I was safe because of my performance reviews, but apparently that didn't matter. I felt a flicker of sympathy for him, despite everything he had put me through over the years. "I'm sorry to hear that, Miguel. That must be really difficult." "It gets worse," he continued, his hands shaking slightly as he held his coffee cup. "I had been living beyond my means for months, thinking my job was secure. I bought the new car, put a down payment on a house, took out loans to furnish it. I thought I could handle the payments easily with my salary." He paused, looking out at the lake as if gathering courage to continue. "Now I'm facing bankruptcy, Chloe. The house payment, the car payment, the credit cards. I can't cover any of it without my job. I've been applying everywhere, but nobody's hiring right now. At least not at the salary level I need." I nodded, beginning to understand why he had driven 2 hours to find me. I was hoping, he said, then stopped and started again. I know things haven't been great between us, and I know I haven't always been the most supportive brother. But I was wondering if maybe you could help me out. Just temporarily, until I get back on my feet. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Just a month ago, this same man had been laughing at me, calling me a failure, suggesting I'd be lucky to work at a fast food restaurant. Now he was sitting in my beautiful lakefront home, asking me for financial help. What kind of help are you looking for? I asked calmly. I need about $8,000 to cover my immediate expenses and buy me some time to find a new job, he said, his voice getting smaller with each word. I know it's a lot to ask, and I wouldn't be here if I had any other options. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch between us as I considered my response. I set down my coffee cup and looked directly at Miguel, watching as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The desperation in his eyes was palpable, and I could see him trying to calculate what my response might be. For just a moment, I felt a trace of the old Chloe, the one who would have scrambled to help family no matter how they had treated me. But that Chloe was gone. Miguel, I said slowly, I have to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. He nodded eagerly, clearly hoping this was leading toward me agreeing to help him. When you were sitting at that dinner table a month ago, watching Dad tear me apart, what were you thinking? His face flushed slightly, and he looked down at his hands. Chloe, No, I interrupted. Don't give me excuses or try to minimize it. I want to know what was actually going through your mind when you laughed at me and told Dad I'd be lucky to get a job at a fast food restaurant. The silence stretched between us as Miguel struggled to find words. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been remorse. I thought you were wasting your life, he admitted. I thought you needed a wake-up call. A wake-up call, I repeated slowly. And now you're here, in my lakefront cabin that costs more per month than you were making at the bank, asking me for money because you're facing bankruptcy. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the pristine lake that had become my daily view. Behind me, I could hear Miguel's sharp intake of breath as the full implications of what I had just said sank in. Chloe, he said, his voice barely audible. What exactly do you do for work? I turned back to face him, and for the first time in my life, I had the upper hand with my older brother. I run a digital marketing firm, I said simply. I have 7 major clients, and my monthly revenue is currently $63,000. The color drained from Miguel's face as he processed what I had just told him. I watched him do the mental math, realizing that I was making more in a single month than he had been earning in an entire year at his banking job. $63,000 a month, he stammered. Yes, and before you ask, that's gross revenue, but my profit margins are quite good since I keep my overhead low. I've been building this business for 3 years, and I'm currently worth just over $840,000. Miguel's mouth fell open, and he looked around the cabin again with new understanding. This wasn't some lucky break or temporary situation. This was the result of years of hard work and success that he and our family had completely dismissed. But how? You don't have a college degree. You don't have any formal business training. I smiled at the irony of his question. Turns out, success doesn't always follow the traditional path that Dad and you were so convinced was the only way. Chloe, I had no idea. If I had known... You would have what? I interrupted. Been nicer to me? Supported me? Defended me when Dad was tearing me down? He fell silent, clearly realizing there was no good answer to that question. The truth is, Miguel, you and Dad made it very clear how you felt about me and my choices. You didn't believe in me when I had nothing to show for my efforts, so why should I trust you now that I'm successful? I walked back to my chair and sat down, maintaining eye contact with him. You came here asking for $8,000, I continued. That represents less than 36 hours of revenue for my business. Financially, helping you would be trivial for me. Miguel's eyes lit up with hope, but I wasn't finished. However, I have a very strict policy about who I choose to help. Years had passed since my family dinner breakdown, and the sting of their dismissal still burned fresh. Miguel sat before me now, humbled and desperate, waiting for my decision. I reached for a glass of water from the side table and took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch between us. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and measured. I'm sorry, Miguel, but I only invest in people who believed in me when it mattered. The words hit him like a physical blow. I watched as his face crumpled, the last shred of hope draining from his expression. He opened his mouth as if to argue or plead, but no words came out. I think you should leave now, I said gently but firmly. Miguel stood up slowly, his movements mechanical and defeated. He looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the success he had mocked just weeks earlier. When he reached the door, he turned back to me. Chloe, please. I'm your brother. Yes, I replied. You are. And as my brother, you had countless opportunities to support me, to believe in me, to defend me when Dad was tearing me down. You chose not to. Now you have to live with the consequences of that choice. He left without another word, and I watched through the window as he got into his car and drove away, disappearing down the winding mountain road. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and stepped out onto the deck, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The lake stretched out before me, peaceful and serene, reflecting the afternoon sun like a mirror. As I stood there, I thought about how far I had come from that humiliating family dinner just a month ago. I had built something remarkable entirely on my own terms, without their support or approval. Their rejection had hurt deeply, but it had also freed me to pursue my own path without the burden of their expectations or judgment. In the months that followed, the consequences of my family's cruelty became increasingly apparent. Miguel never found another banking position that matched his previous salary, and within 6 months, he had lost both his house and his car to repossession. He was forced to move back in with our parents, his pride shattered, and his financial future uncertain. Our father's auto shop began struggling as well, partly due to increased competition, and partly because of poor financial decisions he had made while believing his son's banking career made him a financial expert. The pension fund he had invested in collapsed due to mismanagement, wiping out most of his retirement savings. The family that had once dismissed me as worthless now found themselves facing the very financial instability they had predicted would be my fate. As for me, I continued to build my business from my beautiful lakefront home, surrounded by the peace and inspiration of the mountains and lake. My client base has grown to 12 major companies, my monthly revenue has reached 6 figures, and I recently crossed the $2 million net worth milestone. Looking back on that painful dinner and the journey that followed, I realized that their cruelty had been the greatest gift they could have given me. It forced me to prove to myself just how much I was truly worth, and the revenge of my success tastes sweeter than any apology ever could.